So it's when Avery and I initially put our schedule together for Sequitur, we had found somebody else to take this week and next week, the last 2 weeks of Lent, because we knew that my life was going to be crazy. And then the person was not able to do it. They got it was Jeff, who's a professor at St. Joe's. He wasn't able to manage to do these 2 sessions, so I'm covering this one, and Avery's covering the next. But I have to say that I've been slaving on it today, but I don't feel as versed in this as I'd like to be. But I hope that at least we can gain some insight, and I think we can at least make a good go of it. The fortunate thing is that I've done a lot of study in this area. The unfortunate thing is that it was 20 years ago. So some of it's rusty, so it's just bringing some of these. Hopefully I remember the terminology well with you, both from my college days at St. Anselm, where I was a philosophy major, and then my seminary days as well. So one of the readings that we assigned to you is the Nicomachean Ethics. I don't know if many of you have read Aristotle. We kind of hear, it's kind of one of these names that, right, everyone's like, oh yeah, Plato, Aristotle. But, so it's kind of one of those Greek philosophers. But I think, I don't know if just in reading, one of the things that always has struck me about Aristotle or reading any of the ancient Greeks is how much they sound so contemporary in some ways. And you realize, well, boy, this is somebody writing 2,500 years ago, and they sound like they could very well be speaking of our own time in many ways. The other piece is that I think, given the depth of analysis and just the insight, when you think about, like, Aristotle did not have an Aristotle to read, right? So we have someone who is really coming to these things just from his own reflection. And so I've always just been astounded by the brilliance of the minds of these people. And I think it puts to rest any kind of historical supremacy that we might feel, as if we somehow are more intelligent or more noble even, or better than people who lived 2,500 years ago. If anything, in some ways, when you read his description, for example, of politics and how he speaks of the political life and the nobility of trying to pursue the common good, and I think about how far that is from us during this election year, the idea of trying to promote good citizens and look out for the well-being of society in this kind of holistic way, just without even, it makes you just really reflect, I think, about our own time and how we might be evaluated in the future as far as where our culture is at. So I don't know if you had, now hopefully you didn't get half a page into Aristotle and say, oh boy, where's the next reading? Because I realized, and part of it, we try and find a decent translation, but I think that's part of this too. These are writers who are, it's not so much that it's hard vocabulary, right? It's that it's complex thinking. And we're not really used to doing that in our culture. We're not really used to analyzing arguments and taking premises and then arriving at a conclusion based on premises in a logical sequence. We tend to just shout conclusions at each other. And if you don't agree with me, then you're not on my team. And then if you do agree with me, you are on my team. But there's very little like, well, how did you get to that answer? Here's how I got to mine. Well, if this is the case, and this is the case, and this is the case, well, then that would seem to imply that this should be true. Like these kinds of, that's an argument, right? Is to like make a case. And I think we as a culture, we're not very used to engaging in that kind of dialogue. So what's the first area that Aristotle really tries to go after, and I think really is foundational when we're looking at human action, is like, why does anybody do anything? Why do we get out of bed in the morning? Like, what's the meaning of life, basically, right? You might remember the famous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. They are trying to find the meaning of life forever, and they get to the final thing, and it's like they have this huge computer. It's like working on this for I don't even know how long. It's like this supercomputer, and then finally spits out the answer. The meaning of life is 42. And they're like, what the heck? And then they're like, well, what's the question then? And it's like, well, I'm going to need all this time to figure that out. So it's like, it kind of makes light of the whole thing. But Aristotle didn't make light of it. He really felt like this was critical, that like, what are we trying to do here? What is the goal? And one of the things, so he says, well, what motivates people? What motivates people? And he says that generally, when you look around, you realize that most people are pursuing things that are not ends in and of themselves, right? So they pursue money, but it's not because they want money. It's because they want happiness. And money will buy them happiness. Or at least that's what they think. Or maybe money will buy them fame. And they think they want fame. But it's not really fame that they want. Because the fame is really to give them, again, a sense of accomplishment or fulfillment. So he kind of goes through this analysis. And basically, this was a common kind of argument within philosophical circles. It's like, what's the most noble thing to pursue? What should we be trying to do in this life? And he says, well, and there had been philosophers that proposed that really happiness is what we seek. And there are reasons, right, for that he gives. That basically, you don't praise somebody for being happy. You congratulate them. Because happiness is considered to be an end in and of itself. It's not a means to an end. You're not happy so that you can do something. Right? Happiness is the reward. So he says, otherwise, he said there'd be an infinite regress. Like you would never find what you were looking for. If there was nothing that was an end in and of itself, then we'd basically be slated to live lives of misery, because if happiness was just a means to another end, right? But it's not, right? There is this sense of happiness that really underlies why do we do what we do. We want to find happiness. Now it's interesting, though, he makes some distinctions because he wants to make it clear it's not the kind of Epicurean happiness. This is not mere pleasure. Because one of the things he notes is that if it's just pleasure, that this is something that can be given and taken away. It's very dependent on circumstances, right? And so you could see then how if we were seeking or searching for happiness, but you'd have a hard time. Well, he points out at one place, depending on the circumstances, somebody could go from happy to miserable multiple times in a given day, depending on what happens to the person. And not only what happens to them, but what happens to their children, or what happens to their friends, or what happens to their family, what happens to the world around them. Everything really, if just this kind of pleasure or a kind of more superficial, he says, well, that's not really, there's no stability to it. There's no solidity in it. And so he says that to entrust to chance what is greatest and most noble would be a very defective argument. Right? If you were to, then it was basically saying, well, if God favors you, you're happy, and that's good for you. But pretty much the other person who doesn't get much out of life, well, they are just kind of up a creek. And he said, well, that doesn't really, there's something, though, he says that there's a happiness that's deeper than that, that can endure even if misfortune befalls someone, and they're able to endure it. And he says that that is a happiness. So he says, those who are able to remain happy or to remain fulfilled in life are those whose souls live in accordance with perfect virtue. So he really gets to the place where he says it's in living virtuously, because he says even the virtuous man is able to find happiness in the good things in life. He's able to live in a way that he can receive the most joy and the most fulfillment and the greatest good that life has to offer. So even if and I'm saying he, but it's obviously both. What did my mom always used to say? If somebody said, look out, it's a man-eating tiger, it's not like just the men would run. But we got to choose a pronoun. Anyway, I'll switch it up from time to time, but Aristotle, he's saying the virtuous person is able to, even if they undergo great trials, they can do so with nobility. And though he doesn't come right out and say it, there's a certain kind of happiness there. Right? Now, it's interesting. Aristotle, of course, lived 500 years before Jesus. And so there's no Christian insight here. This is based purely off of philosophical reasoning. And yet at the same time, you can see how Christians would have read Aristotle and said, wow, Aristotle would have been Christian, right? That's kind of how he said Plato would have been Christian. Aristotle, these people who really used reason very well, arrived at a place where they would have been very open to the God of reason, who is the truth. And that there would have been there's this intellectual kind of foundation that was very capable of receiving the gospel. And that's why Christians very quickly took up Aristotelian and Platonic metaphysics and ethics and integrated them into a Christian worldview. So he says that happiness is found by those souls who live in accordance with perfect virtue. But here's the rub. So he says, well, how do you attain virtue? How do you attain perfect virtue? By living the virtues, right? It's through habit, right? Virtue is a habit, just like vices are habits. And this is a critical thing that he notes, and it's a strain that it's actually kind of part of the way this was titled, right? The topic for today It's titled The Morally Responsible Person, which is another kind of way of putting John Paul II's book, The Acting Person. And it's to talk about in a point, and you think Aristotle's bad. I was reading through John Paul II's The Acting Person, and because I was thinking of assigning you a chapter out of that book, and I was like, I think they would shoot me. Well, I gave them a chapter from that. Did I tell you the story about, did I tell you about the Polish nun who, when I was in Rome, I was a chaplain to the Missionaries of Charity. They have a house in the Vatican, so I would go offer Mass for them when I was, my final year I was ordained before I went back. And there was a sister who was a missionary of charity who was from Poland. And at one point I was saying, I don't know, I was reading one of these, and I was reading something of John Paul II's, and I said to her, boy, I'll tell you, he's tough to read. I said, you have such an advantage, you can read him in Polish. And she said, are you kidding? She said, his Polish is impossible. I read him in English. So it was Benedict XVI is much easier reading. People don't realize that, but John Paul II was very much a philosopher, very philosophical in his writing. But in The Acting Person, John Paul II, one of the key pieces that he takes, it's not something that he invented, but he extrapolates and articulates and moves it forward, is this idea that your acts, and this should be pretty, Aristotle says, and only an idiot wouldn't realize this, but your actions over time make the person. So there's you become what you do, right? And this is part of what Aristotle's talking about too. But you see this is it certainly is not understood very well among children. Right? But even among a lot of adults, they kind of think, and you get this sometimes, for example, well, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I hate that phrase because part of that goes directly against this, right? It's like, well, it may not kill you, but it might turn you into a monster. Right? It may not kill you, but it might turn you into a completely scared, timid person who can't leave the house. It may not kill you, but if you do things that are wrong, our actions change us. It's not like so there's the danger in our modern conception is that there's me over here, like this is me, and then there are the things that I do over here somewhere. And, or the things that I think, that's over here somewhere. But I shouldn't be, and you get this, and it's like, why should you hold me responsible for this thing that I did? That's what I did. That's not who I am. And it's like, well, there's a bit of a connection here, right? And the connection is that over time, especially, your actions, and this is why our tradition says, you've got to do the right thing. Well, why? Because doing the right thing makes you good. And doing the wrong thing makes you bad. And you change. And anybody who's had serious, we've all had our moments, right? But anybody who's had serious failures or flaws, they know, right, that you carry it. It doesn't just go away. And similarly, doing great works of virtue has an incredibly salutary and beneficial effect, right? We are fundamentally constituted by what we do, by what we practice, especially, like what we do every single day. And this, you can see why, for example, our church has such, we talk about ritual. Well, what is ritual? It's to, and you can see within Aristotle, this is why Aristotle's like, education is so important, right? That we are fostering virtue, that we're helping people to do the right thing regularly, so that they just get used to doing it, so that it builds their character, right? It builds them into it gives them the capability of being a virtuous person. What's interesting though, so then when Aristotle goes into then virtue, right? He says virtue, did you catch this? He says virtue is the mean between two extremes, right? So and I think the Greek word, if I recall correctly, is that it's that virtue kind of is hitting the mark, right? So hitting the mark, ching. That's an arrow. Bullseye, hee-haw, right? Hitting the mark, that's virtue, hitting the mark. And Aristotle points out, well, it's a lot easier to not hit the mark than it is to hit the mark, right? In fact, he says you can be bad in many ways, but you can only be good in one. And so virtue is, and to do this consistently, to hit the mark consistently and to enjoy it, that is the virtue, and that is not easy, and it's not common. So what he says, so another way of seeing it though is like these, you can see it as the mean between two extremes. So for example, what is fortitude? Virtue, right? And Avery's going to go into this next week. She's going to talk about virtues, but I'm just giving you a little start, and then we'll look at it. But fortitude would be between the two. Cowardice, and what would be rash, being rash, right? Or what's the bold? Did you say? Yeah, maybe bold, but even more like he has a word for it, but it's just charging in without, it's brazen or rash. Yeah, brazen, rash. We'll say, I like brazen, that's a good word. Surprised people don't name their kids that these days. Name them everything else. The challenge is then, you can see, it's like he says, hitting the mark is like trying to find this point here. It's like, and it's rather challenging because many times he says in society, sometimes people even praise people for being cowardly, or they praise them for being brazen if it suits their purposes. So sometimes you get these kinds of false signals as to what virtue really looks like. And so it's not easy to know what does the virtue of fortitude really look like, as opposed to cowardice and brazenness. It's not easy, right? So that's one challenge. So he talks about, in another place, but he refers to it in these books, he talks about kind of 4 types of people. So in terms of, basically, we're in relation to virtue. So he talks about the vicious person. So the vicious person being the person who is controlled by vices, right? Vicious, vice. Not vicious like we would talk about a vicious dog, but vicious more in the sense of controlled by their passion, by their vices. So a vicious person, their arrows are like, right? And furthermore, a vicious person is like, there isn't a target. A vicious person they're not even aiming. They're just like, right? So a vicious person isn't even trying to be good. A vicious person is just like, where's the next beer? A vicious person is like, where's the next woman? Where's the next fight? Where's the next, post? They're just controlled by their appetites. They have no ability to regulate. They're just completely compulsive. Right? It's just complete compulsion. And there's no real reasoning with them. It's like, you need to do the right thing. They're like, that's fine for you. Right? Like, I'm going to just sit here and smoke weed. Right? You're like, well, look at all these things that you're letting go. Yeah, that's your opinion. Leave me alone. You mind your own business. Right? So a vicious person is like, they're just not trying to do the right, they're not trying to think. Right? Their conscience has been kind of just, they're really at an animal type level. Like, where like a dog is like, where's my food? It's just their basic kind of instinct level functioning. Unfortunately, people get there, right? It can happen. And the sad thing about this is really, this is the easiest person to manipulate, right? Why does, like, if you look at this, happens all the time with people with human trafficking and other kinds of ways that people are really horrifically abused, is that if they're addicts, if they're really, the people have gotten themselves into a really compromised position, they're very easy to manipulate, right? You can use people like this easily. Because as long as you have what they want, they'll do what you ask. Or you threaten what they need, and they'll do what you ask. Because they don't act on principle. Right? So it's actually, this is a form of slavery, right? People who are slaves to their passions, and then they are very easily also enslaved by other people who are in power. He talks about another kind of place of being the incontinent person. And the continent person. I think the only time we use these terms now has to do with being able to control your digestive system. This has nothing to do with diapers. Okay, incontinence, in this case, has to do with, again, our relationship to the virtues. So the continent person and the incontinent person are both separated from the vicious person in that they are seeking to live the virtues. So they're shooting for the mark. They're aiming for the target. Right? But the incontinent person misses. Because their vices are too strong, and they don't have the habit of virtue. So this person wants to get up on time, but just can't quite manage it. Wants to quit drinking, but just keeps falling. Wants to do this. This is the person who's struggling against sin, against vice, right? They're struggling to do the right thing. Whereas the continent person is kind of, we could call them your convert. So this person does the right thing, but it gives them no joy. So they are we might call them the white knuckling crowd. They sit there and they're like, I'm going to pray the rosary, but I hate it. Like, I'm bored out of my mind. I'm gonna be nice to my mom, but she's driving me crazy, and I'm gonna do this, but and so, like, I'm gonna go the speed limit, but I really want to hit the gas, right? That's this person. Okay, they do the right thing, but they really don't want to. Their desires are not on board. So they might hit the mark, but when they do, they're like, I really would rather just hit the ceiling. They really don't care. They're not dialed in. This person, on the other hand, hasn't even gotten to they can't, they're still tied in. They're trying to do the right thing, but they're still kind of trapped. So when they want to speed, they do it anyway, even though they know it's wrong. And this person's like, all right, speed limits, they're just a suggestion. Let's go. Right? They're like, who cares about speed limits? Are we going to get caught? No? Okay. Right? So, does that kind of... Well, these are all relationships to virtue. And then the virtuous person... By contrast, the virtuous person is the person who aims for the mark, hits the mark, and really enjoys hitting the mark. That's the person who goes the speed limit and likes it. Who takes care of their mom and is like, isn't she sweet? And you're like, how in the world do you think she's sweet?
I give more credit to the continent person.
Well, so...
They don't want to. Like people, if you want to do something, you deserve all the credit for having done it.
You must have some Irish in you. You gotta suffer. It's not worth anything. No, I mean there. It's true, but there is a lacking there because, and I think even now there may be a certain value, a heroic kind of dimension to a person struggling against their own inclinations, right? However, I think even the person would realize that the reality of that struggle points to a bit of a deficit in their character. That if, for example, if they really saw their mother as God sees their mother, they would think that she was just beautiful. And there's something kind of impoverished about them, or lacking, that makes it a struggle. Now, they're willing to kind of compensate for that lacking, but the better part would be not to love because you have to love, but to love because you want to. Because, I mean, even though it's not as much work, it's more genuine, and it's more authentic, and it's more fully an expression of who you are. When you love not because you think it's the right thing to do, but you love because
You feel the love.
you just, it's a natural response, right? So even though in some ways I agree with you, there's a kind of heroic quality to the continent person. There's a kind of excellence that is unique to a truly virtuous person, in that they can walk into a room and give themselves freely. They are completely authentic, and they will be just really good to everyone. It's not put on. They are not. It's not an act. They're not doing it because that's what they're expected to do, or that's what's right to do, or they're doing that because that's what they think just naturally is how they want to interact with people. Like, that's just what they do. Yeah.
Idea that I had for Aristotle, he said that friendship is the strongest love you can have, and how that friendship is
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about how that is like how Jesus taught us to love our neighbors ourselves, and it's through friendship that we can practice virtue. So, and like through our interactions with other people, so we like isolate ourselves from the world and focus on God, and we can practice most.
Well, and that's where, I think you're absolutely, back to that kind of theme of these things, you become vicious because you act viciously, because basically you follow your vices. And you become virtuous because you do virtuous things. And these are kind of this is where most of us are, right? Most of us alternate between these two, right? We're either kind of holding it together or not so much, right? Like, most all of us are here. Like, and Aristotle, interestingly, says that if you're not born and raised here, the chances of you moving from any of these to the virtuous person are like nil. He's very pessimistic. So he says basically, if you haven't been raised, it's basically like saying, and I will say though, so if you're raised on Pop-Tarts and I don't know, pick your junk food. Like, you just grow up in like a house where that's what you eat, and all you eat is junk food. Now, you might get to a place where you start eating healthy food. But the problem is that you're gonna every once in a while be like, oh, I could really use a Pop-Tart. Because it's so deeply, like, you have memories of your mom toasting you up a Pop-Tart when you were coming in from the cold on a winter day. And it just reminds you of being loved. And that Pop-Tart means so much more to you than the Pop-Tart. It means, this whole maternal care for your being. So that's the problem, right? Is when you have these kinds of, when you're brought up in a way that, and when you rehearse a kind of different kinds of vices, especially when you're young, they're not just in isolation, they get connected with all these other things in your life. And to wrestle out, you almost have to lose part of yourself in order to gain virtue. You're almost cutting off your own legs in order to save your body.
We have to rid ourselves of the attachment to the Pop-Tarts.
And then it also is like, well, how do I not throw my mother out with my dietary change? My mother always showed me her love by feeding me junk food, and I decided to become a vegan. How am I not betraying my mother? Right? So it becomes very challenging, and this is why he said, at one point, he was very stark. He said it's like all the like raising children in virtue is like all the difference. like basically, like if you don't get it right, he's very strong on this, Aristotle. And also, he has a pretty aristocracy. He has a pretty aristocratic sense here, which is basically like, if you don't come from a family that is a virtuous family, which probably has virtuous families going back a whole long way, then good luck. Like if you are raised by vicious people, your chances of being vicious are like really high. And so there's a kind of stratification for Aristotle. His idea, now for him, to get here is really, really hard. To fall from here is really, really easy. Remember how he said it's very hard to hit the mark. It's very easy to miss it. And so to become a virtuous person is like just a few people on the top. And a lot of them end up falling off that wagon. Because even if they grow up in a virtuous home, they get caught up in money, they get caught up in fame, they get caught up in different things, and pretty soon they're no longer virtuous. But God forbid, if you grow up in a vicious home, the chances of you getting to a place where you're virtuous, where you just naturally do the right thing in the right way at the right time for the right reason, good luck.
So how do you convince that? Can we convince that?
Now, I will say, as far as if you want to analyze things on the level of pure just reasonableness, this is borne out pretty well by our experience. And I would say it's probably very true that the number of people who really live who are really virtuous, it's really hard. Again, let's remember, he goes through, and we'll talk about it next week, Gabriel will, but when you go through and you look at all the different virtues, to be prudent and temperate and just and have courage, and then all the subset virtues to be just and this is not a matter of a superficial analysis. He's looking at we're talking about real human excellence. When somebody is really just become really selfless and really aligned to doing the good. It's very rare, very hard. Very hard. But notice, with Aristotle, there's no real... Aristotle kind of had a watchmaker concept of God. So Aristotle, there might be, there was kind of this one, it's kind of like you wind up a clock, get it going, and then that's the clockmaker kind of understanding of God. He basically starts everything going, sets the universe in motion, and then he just steps back. There's no sense of a God who has any kind of awareness of, or concern for, or personal relationship with human beings. And there certainly isn't any conception of grace. So as much as this is a very, this is kind of take out the microscope or the magnifying glass, look at humanity, look at human society, look at human nature, and describe it. It's very scientific in that regard. But it is very cold because there's no transcendent dimension. It's very horizontal in that regard. It's very natural. We call this, in many ways, natural law stems from Aristotle, right? Aristotle would be really the Aristotelian anthropology and really the Nicomachean ethics would be really the start of a lot of natural law. So there's a natural analysis, but it doesn't really include a supernatural dimension at all. I think it's interesting in the catechism selection that we had, we talked about Let's see what time it is. 6:45, 9, 6:50. Should we take a break? We'll take a little break. So in some ways with Aristotle we have a very kind of a lofty goal, but also in some ways there's a kind of pessimism about Aristotle in that he doesn't think many people are going to get there. And God forbid if he had actually believed in the afterlife and final judgment, because you have the sense that most people would be in hell if it were Aristotle. It's just, they're just not, although there is that kind of, he just is, anyway, we'll talk about some other pieces with regard to personal responsibility for all of that. But what's interesting to me, I don't know if you noticed in this short, we had a few paragraphs from the Catechism this week. But the Catechism has a little chapter that's called The Morality of the Passions. And I think that this is important because, with Aristotle, and Aristotle and others within the Greek thinking and the Greek tradition, there was a very strong strain that developed and carried into Rome and even in our current day that we know as Stoicism, right? The Stoics. And like Augustine got sucked into, the Manichaeans were a bit of this line, and some of the others. There's a strong, you can see how there'd be a tendency then in all of this to say, passions bad, reason good. Right? Like, you just do everything that your reason says, and the most dangerous thing is if you're passionate, you go with your passions and your emotions. Well, and who of course loses out on that in many ways because there's more of a tendency of, I guess, women, right? Women are often being associated with being more intuitive and more emotionally intelligent. And so there's a reason why most of the Stoics were all guys and didn't have a lot of regard for women, because women were like that's not anything they respected. So the Stoic Christians are not Stoics. And we don't think that all emotion and all passions are bad. And even in Aristotle, right? Aristotle, notice he doesn't think you should be having to fight emotions. He thinks that it's best if your emotions are healthy. In other words, that you're enjoying the right things. That, if you're confronting someone and you're having to confront them because there's an unjust situation, that he wants you to feel good about it. Right? Most of us were like, I got to do this because it's the right thing, but it's freaking making me a nervous wreck and making my stomach turn upside down. He's like, no, it should be, if you have the virtue, you go into that situation, you're like, here's what it is, this is what you did wrong, and you handle it very well, and it doesn't make you nervous, and you just feel like you had a normal day. Well, that's very nice. That'd be nice, right? It's like, so Aristotle, he's not a Stoic either. He's not saying just like all passions, all emotions are bad, but it's a matter of the passions needing to be trained. They're not reasonable, so they need to be aligned. And this is where Now I'm forgetting there's a famous analogy. Maybe one of you knows it. The analogy of the passions, the will, and the intellect. And it's envisioned, so there's the rider. The rider, the horse, and then there's so the rider is the will. The horse is the intellect. Wait a minute. No. The rider is the intellect. There we go. The horse is the will, because it's the one that moves you. And then the passions are a tiger. So I'm not going to draw the tiger. Tiger. The passions. So, in the vicious person, the tiger is chasing the horse with the rider. Right? That's what's going on. The tiger is in control, and the intellect is just telling it, let's get out of here. Or it's the tiger. It's chasing the rider and the horse. In virtue, the tiger has a nice little leash and is just walking peacefully next to the rider and the horse. The tiger becomes the pet tiger. So the passions are just as strong, just as robust, but they're in control. And they're not chasing the operation down the road. I forget, I'm probably not exactly doing justice to that analogy, certainly with my drawing capability, but probably also in the completeness of the explanation. But it basically is to give you that sense of at least this relation between intellect. It's not that the passions are bad, right, or emotions are bad. It's just that they need to be aligned and they can't govern the whole thing, right? And basically the Catechism says as much. It says, passions and emotions or feelings or movements that incline us to act or not to act in regard to something felt or imagined even, they're neutral. They're neutral. And the Catechism also says that the Holy Spirit can work through them. And that intuition can be a source of wisdom. Intuition is not a rational act, right? And intuition is, this person seems to be in distress. I'm going to try and help. This person seems to be telling the truth. I'm going to believe them. I have this vague notion I should go into this room. I'm going to do it. And so there are ways that the Holy Spirit, sometimes because our intellect just can't process, like if God was like literally speaking, like go into that room, we would probably just like fall over and like not know what to do with ourselves, right? So God has to be more gentle than that. Then He can't give us a direct, rational keys. Like, sometimes people think that God's going to speak from the sky, like go to Nineveh, or something like this. And it's like, well, that's not, most of us couldn't handle go to Nineveh. Most of us would just have to have like a little like weird thing that was like, I just feel like Nineveh is like this place I should go. And then I saw this weird thing in the travel agency. It seems like every ding-busted travel agency window has Nineveh as like discounts on Nineveh. And then my brother-in-law was talking about Nineveh the other day, and he never talks about Nineveh. It's like, well, freaking wake up and go to Nineveh. Right? But I think that's often where, God tends to be a little bit more subtle, and because he knows we can't quite handle getting smacked upside the head. We get a kind of a God concussion, if there is such a thing. So I think that's where, that's the reality there. But the passions in that regard. And the thing, too, I would say, it's very important. And so Ignatian spirituality gets into this a lot about how important it is to really be discerning about the passions. When we find ourselves... So Ignatius had this insight when he was lying in the hospital bed, right? And he said, I'm reading all these, or I'm thinking about all these heroic exploits that I could undertake. He had been shot, cannon had taken out one of his legs, and he was in the hospital for months and months. So he's lying there, and he'd been this heroic kind of soldier, very vain, very into his own glory. And so he's thinking about all these women and things, these conquests and various things he's going to do. But he also had a book of the life of Christ, I think it was, on his bedside table. And so he would read that from time to time. And what he noticed was that when he was thinking about all these exploits and conquests and various things, that he would sometimes feel great about it, but then it would leave him feeling kind of empty. And that then when he was reading this life of Christ, that it would fill his heart and give him a deeper and more lasting kind of sense of peace and fulfillment. And so he said, well, there's something here that's resonating, there's something more true here. So I think, so Ignatius talks a lot about consolation and desolation, and discernment in the context of consolation and desolation. Where is the Holy Spirit, prompting us or leading us? You have to be careful in these things, because sometimes other things can masquerade as consolation that are not true consolations, or desolations that are not true desolations. It's all very complicated. I do think generally there is the right ordering, though, and in terms of a Christian perspective, reason needs to govern. Reason needs to govern. It's not that we don't do sometimes there are things that our reason can't fully comprehend, and they're worth doing. And faith itself, right, is beyond our comprehension, but it's not unreasonable. It's not irrational. It's just irrational. So it's beyond our ability to comprehend, which is different. It's different to say, I don't know, to say there's an island off the coast that you haven't seen. Okay, that could be the case. That's a very different thing to say there's an island that's in your stomach. You're like, what are you talking about? You're nuts, right? That's irrational, right? So there's irrational, which is like something that doesn't work. It's not logical. It contradicts reason. That's a very different thing from something being beyond what our reason can comprehend. And the passions and the emotional life that we have in that way, I think, can be a source of wisdom in a way that God's grace does work and communicate to us things that are beyond our ability to comprehend at various times. But it needs to be checked by reason still, because it never would violate reason, right? It's not going to violate the truth. So if God's not going to tell you to do something that's wrong. He's not going to tell you to do something. Sometimes, like I had somebody who's like mentally ill said God told him he was supposed to go. There was a synagogue down the street. He was supposed to go punch some Jews in the face. It's like, well, that's not God, right? Like, I don't care how strong that intuition might have been, right? Like, so no matter what the intuition is, it still has to fall in line with reason, right? Always. So I want to look now at the moral, human act, the conscience and human acts. And this gets us to our the Catechism, and then the little excerpt from John Finnis on moral absolutes. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking, man, I should have had them read Veritatis Splendor. How is that bad? So I don't know. Maybe next year I think I'm going to switch out the Martin Buber reading for Veritatis Splendor. But if you want to read Veritatis Splendor, would be a good one at this. I think that would be an appropriate reading at this juncture. Because John Paul II basically goes through really just the basic foundations of moral action. And also some of the areas that John Finnis speaks about in moral absolutes. So anyway, if you feel like reading something for fun on your free time, the Veritatis Splendor. It starts with the passage in the Gospel where the young man comes up and asks Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What should I do? So, the conscience. It's an interesting thing, right? The conscience. We kind of take for granted, but it's fascinating to me how universal it is. You know, when you think about that, we all have this. We take for granted, and we also take for granted that a dog is not going to have one, right? I mean, we don't put dogs on trial and send them to prison. We don't put cats on trial and put them on parole. We kind of all inherently know that there's something different about a human person, that a human being has the ability to choose between right and wrong, and therefore is a morally responsible agent. You know that, I don't know if this John, or not John, what's his name? Covey, Stephen Covey always, I don't think he made it up, but he just divides the word. Like, if you're responsible, it means you are response-able. You're capable of responding. If you weren't capable of responding, you wouldn't be responsible. So inherent within the concept of being responsible is that you have the ability, you have the freedom and the capability to actually affect the situation. If you didn't, you wouldn't be responsible. Right? So we are responsible, and what makes us responsible is that we have a conscience. And every person has a moral conscience. It's interesting, sometimes anthropologists would try to dispute this and say, well, in some cultures they think that it's fine to do this or that or the other thing. But, you can lie to this person, but you say, well, but do they still think it's good to lie to your best friend? No. Like, even though there might be some variation sometimes on cultural norms, it's actually remarkable how we're very aligned on, like, and the kinds of things that cause people to be so you see this play out. Remember how we talked, I think, about the nature of sacrifice in religious practice and the need to appease the gods, right? And to offer sacrifice. Well, why? Because of a guilty conscience, right? So the kinds across every culture, people would do things and they didn't feel like it was just enough to apologize to the people around them, or there was this sense that they had violated some larger, greater law, some larger will, and that needed to be appeased. Why not? Why would you offer sacrifice to the gods if you weren't trying to, like, say, sorry, don't smite me, I know I screwed up? Well, why? What is telling you that? Well, that's called your conscience. Your conscience is saying, I don't care if you forgive me. I don't care if you're okay with this now. I don't care if you tell me, oh, you didn't really know any better. I know that this little voice in here is telling me that I didn't do the right thing. And it's not about you and it's not about me, that there's some other thing speaking here. And sometimes I don't like hearing from it, but it still talks. And so the Catechism says the conscience bears witness to the authority of truth in reference to the supreme good to which the human person is drawn. In other words, the conscience, a healthy conscience, speaks the truth and functions as a kind of barometer of moral life, right? And so it's, in that regard, it's really, I think sometimes it's like this, I don't like the good angel, bad angel stuff. We see the conscience, it's very easy to see the conscience as kind of this nag. Nobody likes a nag. Like, stop nagging me. But it's really, it's kind of, it should be more perceived like a security system, right? That it's saying, intruder alert, intruder, like this is, something's not right. There's a door left open. There's a window open, or somebody's in the building that shouldn't be in here. It's saying something got into your house that's not supposed to be there, and you're in danger. You are in danger. That's really, why did God give us a conscience? Because He loves us and He wants to help us to be protected from the evil one, from the lies of the evil one, from being deceived. He wants to protect us from being hurt. Right? So the conscience is a profoundly beautiful gift from God. It's not a burden. It's to say, this is hurting you, or it's gonna hurt you. You gotta take care of this. You gotta address this. And so it's meant to spur us to action, right? Now, we have an obligation, the Catechism says, basically summarizing Catholic tradition, to follow our consciences, right? And that should be kind of a no-brainer in the sense of, it's kind of like I tell people, it's kind of like saying, you got to wear a parachute before you jump out of an airplane. Well, yeah. I mean, I guess you can see that as a burden. I got it. They made me wear this parachute. Well, yeah, sorry about that. You know? No, it's given to us to protect us and to keep us safe. So, in that regard, you know, our conscience, we should listen to it because if somebody loves you, you should listen to them. And the Catechism has this interesting line in there. It says, being present to ourselves. We should be present to ourselves in order to hear the voice of our consciences. In other words, we can ignore it, right? We have the capability of just la 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 la. You know, and you see this with little kids sometimes. You see this very obviously. Sometimes they will they're funny that way. When you're like, what are you doing? Nothing. You know, and you're like, you know what you're. No. You're like, oh, for God's sakes. Is there just? It's funny. Did you notice how Aristotle says boys are not able to little young kids are not able to really choose things? He said that in the thing. He's like they might do things somewhat voluntarily, but they're not able to really freely choose. They're too little. There's not enough maturity there to. Which is kind of an interesting thing, but yeah, that's true. There's also there's dignity in having what we call a clear conscience, right? That we're meant to be able to live with a clear conscience. That there is something about, I don't know, have you ever read Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when your conscience is not at peace, it really has an impact, and it has a tendency even towards psychosis, because you're fundamentally out of order, and you get all kinds of, if you will, to use that same analogy, you get all kinds of strangers in the house, and you're not secure. Your house isn't secure. And you know it. So then you're anxious. You're like, I don't know, I just live here. There's just some things going on. I just live here. Right? Whose house? What house? I don't know, that kind of thing. So the conscience, when it's not clear, when it's not secure, it lacks integrity, it lacks peace. And that is something that obviously confession is ordered to, right? It's just try and restore integrity and peace to the conscience and to bring healing, to clear out all the riffraff and once again secure things. The Catechism talks about as well the requirement to form our consciences, because there are ways that we can be deceived. People are very capable of, it's not usually that they justify the end, that they distort the goal, right? So I think if you had talked to many Nazis, they would have said, we're pursuing a good and just society. right? We really want to pursue a good and just society. But they had allowed a distortion and a twisting to come in a way that then gave them, where they started to justify means to that end that were horrific. So that's usually where people go wrong. Very rarely do people go wrong with the goal, the end goal. I just want to love. Oh, I just want to stop this horrible person. I just want whatever. All those things, usually the goal that they have in mind is usually good. But where the conscience gets thwarted and screwed up is where, and this is where Finis talks about that there are some actions that you just cannot ever justify. What he calls moral absolutes. And those are actions that are always and everywhere morally wrong. There's no possible justification for them, no matter what the circumstances may be. So it's never permissible, for example, to bombard and blow up, intentionally to blow up and bombard innocent civilians. There's no rationale for doing that. Ever. And you can't justify it. Similarly, abortion. There's no rationale to justify the taking of an innocent, life of a child in the womb. He goes through a number of others in that chapter, but the point is that there are things that they're not just circumstantial. Like you can say, well, in this case, I agree. No, just like every case. There are no cases where you can do that. Because what you're choosing, it doesn't matter what rationale you might have. The thing you're choosing to do is wrong. And you can't choose something wrong. Ever. That's a key principle that the Catechism states, and this is a key principle for our moral teaching. You can never do wrong / evil that good may come of it. You never do something wrong. If you know it's wrong, you can't do something wrong, no matter how noble your goal may be. And Finis tackles this head on because he says, if you do that, notice what you're doing. This is a big word. He says, when you are deciding to do wrong, that good may come of it, you are restricting the moral landscape to your imagination's capacity. You're basically saying, I am going to calculate, I'm going to make this moral calculus based on my own ability to understand what the repercussions of this action are going to be, which is profoundly prideful. And I would say also foolish. Because anybody who has any experience in this world knows that there is no way you can comprehend the repercussions even of the most simple of your actions. And so how in the world could you think that you would know enough about what was going to happen to justify doing something wrong? You won't ever know that much. So you never should do something wrong, because there's no way you can know enough to justify it. Only a fool would think that. Right? And that's a strong argument from Finis. It says, this is just, and that's why you follow your conscience. You do the right thing no matter what the results are, because that's something you can't know. But what you do know is what this is saying. Right? And you know what this is saying, you got to listen to it. No matter what. And he also says, plenty of martyr has died precisely on these grounds, because they wouldn't do something wrong that good may come of it. And the church has recognized again and again that this is really the essence of martyrdom. Better to, look, it's not, better not to offer incense to the gods to save my life. First martyrs, better not to turn over the sacred vessels than to be fed to lions. Better not to be, when I've made a vow of perpetual virginity, better not to be married to this man and to get tortured and killed. So you can go right down the list. Pretty much every martyr, this is why they got it. Because they refused to do evil that good would come of it. Pretty much every martyr. But what's concerning to me is how many Christians today have become what's called proportionalists. Proportionalism allows you to escape this. Proportionalism says, well, let's weigh this out. How bad is this? How good is this? And attempts to apply some form of a calculus to the whole thing. Jeremy Bentham, Karl Marx, modern thinkers, a lot of modern thinkers, because they deny either they deny the freedom of the conscience or they deny the conscience altogether. And they basically say, this is just basically some animal kind of intuition thing. Who knows where that came from? Probably most of the hang-ups from your culture and your parents. That's not any reason to make any decisions. No, if you're smart, when you approach a decision, you should take it and weigh it in a moral calculus. And you should look at what's the cost-benefit analysis here? What's the good that can come? What's the bad that can come? And you stack it up, you see which side of the scale is heavier, you do that. So, clearly, obviously, somebody wants you to offer a little bit of incense to the gods, and you live, where are you going to land on that one? Offer the incense, you idiot. Right? Somebody wants to take out a few politicians so that we can have a just society. Wipe them out. Drop a few bombs so we can win the war. No-brainer. Right? No-brainer. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, no-brainer. Because look at all the horrible death that would have happened if we didn't do that. Well, how do you know? Well, we know. Well, you don't know. The reality is you don't know. Because as Finis says in the chapter that we read, we don't know what would have happened if we had blockaded Japan. We don't know what would have happened if we had negotiated a different kind of truce other than an unconditional truce. We don't know any of those things. All we know is what we did, which was murder hundreds of thousands of people who were innocent and just going about their daily lives. But it was justified, and it was a horrible moral failure on the part of many Catholics who don't understand this. And I wonder sometimes, well, they had a recent thing where some media outlet, they were kidnapped. It was probably back 10, 15 years ago. They were kidnapped by some Islamic extremists, maybe in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they were threatened. And they basically told them, convert to Islam or we're going to kill you. And so the person interviewing them said, well, what'd you do? And they were like, well, we didn't mean it. It's like, okay. So you told a lie. Well, what's it worth? You know, this is the thing that I'm not saying these are easy things, right? But in the end, this is what Christian morality is, and it is born from a fundamental humility that says we are not God. We do not know what's going to happen. The only thing we do know is when I'm very sure that this is right or wrong, I need to listen. And then I need to put the whole thing in God's hands and entrust that He's going to do what needs to be done. Because if He could bring life out of the cross and that horrific thing, if there was anything that somebody could have said, this is the Son of God who's going to be killed here, you think we maybe should not allow this to happen? If there was any time to intervene, that would have been it. So there has to be another thing going on here that we don't understand and we can't comprehend, and it's profoundly arrogant to think that we should take the place of God and decide what is worth doing evil for. But you know, this is a countercultural thing. Nobody thinks like this.
Are you obligated to follow a poorly formed conscience? You don't know you have a poorly formed conscience?
Yes, because what else do you have? I mean, ultimately, that's why you have a duty to try and form your conscience, because it's the only one you got. It's kind of like you got to use your kidneys because they're your kidneys. See, what else? You're not going to use mine, So in the end, your conscience is your conscience, and that's where I think the effort, and that's where the Catechism says we need to be. It's a lifelong task, and that we need to be listening to the Word of God and working on it. This is an interesting thing for me that I find sometimes in confessional conversations and things, people get so disconcerted when they make moral progress. Because they'll be like, oh, I just realized I did all these horrible sinful things in the past. And I'm like, congratulations. That's what I want to say to them. You just moved up in your level of conscience formation. You figured some cool things out. But for them, they're like, I feel like I'm just this horrible person. I'm like, well, no, you were horrible before you didn't know it was horrible. I don't tell them that, but the reality is you're more horrible when you don't know it, right? But you just don't know it. You're sitting in the mud puddle and you just don't know you're in the mud puddle. But it's actually a step forward when you get out of the mud puddle and you can see that you were in the mud puddle. But many times people, they get discouraged because they're like, oh, look at how horrible this was. I'm like, well, great, I'm glad you're seeing it more clearly. You should thank God for that. It's a gift. Like, I don't like this gift. It's like, well, but that is part of when your conscience. This is what happens when your conscience is being formed. You start to pick up on all the subtleties. Like I didn't really listen to that person in that conversation. Or I wasn't really exactly honest. Or that interaction was probably tainted by a certain amount of jealousy. Like these are little things that start, you become more sensitive to things that are where you're just not exactly virtuous. And they become more apparent to you. And you start feeling like, wow, I am kind of really pretty not virtuous. That's why I think what usually happens to most saints is they don't feel better about themselves. Most saints feel, even though they're like doing incredibly beautiful, loving things every day, most saints feel like there's a lot of room for improvement. But what they also often feel is that God's grace and love for them makes up for all their failures. So they don't feel discouraged. And that's important, right? It's important not to be discouraged by the recognition of our failures or the deepening of our conscience. When our conscience becomes more subtle, that's not something that should discourage us. But it should be something that's like, I'm growing. And I tell people this about kind of like, if you were playing baseball and, I don't know, somebody was, you were used to swinging the bat this way, and somebody comes and coaches you and says, no, you're not, your stance is all off. You got to move your feet here and shift your weight this way and do it this way. And you're like, wow, all of a sudden you're going to hit the ball like a whole. If your first reaction is always, I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Well, okay, maybe there's a moment for that. But let's move beyond that. If you sit there and just are like, I wasted all these years hitting the bat hitting the ball the wrong way. Come on. Let's play ball now with you know how to do it. The whole reason the person taught you how to do it is so you could hit the ball the right way. And so let's not dwell on the past. Now you know how to do it. Let's focus on doing it right. But I think sometimes people get caught up in, it's like, oh, I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Fine. That's what, confession, let's move on.
I'm just kind of, there's a lot of dark views right now out there, and I see when we're trying to educate young people like I'm in touch with, like you have this bad view of human nature, like Machiavelli and Marx, and
It's true.
you're trying to help form good consciousness. How do you recommend it?
I think I think there's a lot of very low. It's the opposite of Aristotle, right? Aristotle's saying, look at what we're capable of. Look at this. Like, here's how we can become really excellent human beings. Although even Aristotle is not as optimistic as Christianity, because Aristotle's like, well, probably only a few of you get there, right? But Christianity's like, but even there's God's grace. And with God's grace, all things are possible. And so you could be completely overcome by vice, but God's grace can lift you right out of that, and you can find healing and real virtue. Like, he can really renew and convert you. And so even a person who's been mired in sin can reach the heights of virtue with God's grace. That's why Jesus came. He didn't come to keep virtuous people virtuous. Right? That's what he said. I didn't come for the righteous. I came for sinners. So he didn't keep just to keep people who are doing really good from falling. In fact, he said many times those are the people that are most in trouble because they get prideful. So I think that, we have, as Christians, we have probably, ironically, for like Catholics, but even among Christians, Catholics have the most optimistic human anthropology that you can find. I mean, we believe in freedom of, like, that you have the ability to know what's right and wrong and to choose it. Right there, that's very optimistic. And not only do we have that ability, but we also have help. So that even where we fail and we get sidelined and everything else, God's working with us to try and do this properly. So, like, when you look at all of that, I think, to try and connect people with some, as the Catechism states, the Scriptures, I think also people like C.S. Lewis, I think Chesterton, other kind of more contemporary writers can sometimes really help articulate a Christian worldview in terms that modern thinkers can approach. I find Lewis to be quite good in that regard. There are others, but I think it is a challenge. What was the most popular series in the world for a while was the Game of Thrones, which is basically just Machiavelli. Machiavelli plus, quasi-pornographic stuff. So, it was just like a whole, but the most pernicious thing, and interesting, like even Harry Potter. Somebody, when I was the chaplain at the high school, one of the teachers wanted to read Harry Potter, and the principal was like, "Oh, I don't know, you should talk to the chaplain, that's got witches and stuff in it." So she comes to talk to me, and I was like, I don't think she expected. I was like, well, no, I don't think you should read Harry Potter. I said, because I think it's crap literature. That's the first reason. It's just not well written. But I said, and secondly, it has nothing to do with the witches. I said it's problematic on an ethical, moral level. Because notice in Harry Potter, if somebody is bad or evil, you can do bad or evil things to them. And it's in fact praised. Even Harry Potter's aunt and uncle, his step-parents that he lives with, they're just and Harry Potter is happy and gleeful when bad things happen to bad people, which is fundamentally un-Christian. Christians cannot rejoice in the misfortunes of others. So I think it's problematic in that way, but it's throughout, right? This kind of thing is throughout. Lord of the Rings, on the other hand, would be, again, from a Christian moral ethos, where you have somebody like Bilbo Baggins or like Frodo, who's having a conversation with Gandalf, who's saying, because Frodo's like, I just wish this whole Gollum thing, I wish God would just get rid of this. Why didn't he die? And Gandalf says, well, a lot of people deserve to die, and a lot of people deserve life. And who are you to decide that you're going to give it to them? So, Tolkien is very steeped in our Catholic moral tradition. And you see where he holds up as pinnacles of heroic action those who exactly do this, who refuse to bow down before Sauron or whatever evil force may be and suffer the consequences. And sometimes, and he's not very gentle about it, sometimes it's pretty hard, pretty horrific. But they'd rather suffer than violate their consciences. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's some good literature, there's some good, but unfortunately, it's there's a lot of really pretty junky stuff out there too. Sometimes, it's worth having a conversation. I don't think we want to wrap ourselves in Catholic bubble wrap and roll down the street. That's not the new evangelization, right? I mean, I think some of this is okay, let's go engage this, but then let's have a conversation and talk about how this is really not right, or this is really kind of a little off, or let's watch Harry Potter and then say, well, did you notice that? Yeah, that was kind of weird. That's really not the right way to think about that. So I think sometimes we have to be able to, we have to engage the culture and sometimes do so critically. Teach our children how to be critical consumers.
Nowadays Christians, they kind of abuse mercy of God. Sorry if I said I used a good term, abusing, but they think anything mistakes they made, God mercy covers them, so they do it anyway.
Well, and I think that's where, presumption, right? You're talking about the sin of presumption. The thing about presumption that's not rational is that grace builds on it. You're still, even if God forgives you, it doesn't mean that our Lord still had wounds in his hands and his feet and his side for a reason. And it was to show us, I think, that you carry the scars. And now they may not always pain you, like in his case, right? When he rose from the dead, his scars became signs of how much he loves us and of his power over death, right? So they were transformed into signs of victory rather than defeat. But I think it's important for us to not lose sight, and that's where Aristotle's very helpful in some ways to say, look, if you do bad things again and again and again and again, I don't care how often you go to confession. You are fundamentally changing it's changing who you are. And it's going to have an impact on your nature. It doesn't mean that God won't forgive you. It doesn't mean you're not going to heaven. It might mean a lot more time in purgatory, right? Because there may be a lot more cleaning up that needs to happen because you're just kind of a mess. And it would be better not to be a mess. And furthermore, it's not all about you. What about all the people around you who are impacted by your lack of virtue? Because your lack of virtue always impacts the people around you. And so if you can't find the motivation to choose the right thing on your own, well then choose it for them. Because it is going to impact people. Just like virtue impacts people for the good, vice impacts people for not good. And so, yeah, you can go to confession all the time, but you can't go to confession for the people around you that still get hurt. So I think in that regard, yeah, I think there, although I don't know, yes, it's kind of like the virtue here would be the median between the two extremes of presumption on the one hand, thinking God will forgive. But there's also the other extreme where people are petrified to go to confession, or they don't feel like God's going to ever forgive them, and they keep bringing up things that happened in the past. And they're clinging to things because they don't really trust in his power to save, and they have a darker understanding, more like Aristotle. They just think, well, I'm too screwed up. There's no way God's grace is going to get through this. And that's not good either. Right? I mean, with a God, all things are possible. And so we don't want to be saying, well, that's presumptuous. No, it isn't presumptuous to think that God can save us. Yeah, I mean, that's what he wants to do. So it's to not go to the either extreme, right? So I think that about covers us. We're almost, where are we at? 5 to 8. Usually we take a little time for discussions, huh? We try. We haven't been doing it much. It might be nice to have a little time. What I was thinking is, you know how, so Aristotle's talking about happiness. So the question, I don't know why it popped in my head, I was like, so was Jesus happy? Right? So then it's like, okay, was he happy on the cross? It's hard, right? It's like, but what does happiness mean? Because I think fundamentally, and I think Aristotle even gets this, happiness is not pleasure. But what do we mean then? And what are we really trying? What is it? And then the other question that I had was, is there some, I wonder, I was thinking about it in terms of, well, where does love fit into all this? Like, because it seems to me that you could deprive yourself of happiness even for love of another. Right?
Yeah,
So happiness is self-giving.
So then the question for me was like, well, am I doing that because I want to be happy? I think that being loving is going to make, or it seems to me that this is an area where Aristotle is limited, that love itself is also an end. I don't love people so that I can become happy. Right? I just love them, and I don't seek out love in order to be happy. Right? Sometimes that's a shallow kind of love, maybe, or maybe. But I think I do think that. I think that if you were to and I think this is an area where it's an interesting question. Like, how does this work with? What's the connection between love and happiness? Or what's the tie? How does that tie together? And are we seeking in the end, because Jesus teaches us, right, that everything that the moral commandments all rest on is the two foundational commandments. Love of the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't say do that because it's going to make you happy.
Well, love is virtuous, and being virtuous makes you happy.
But the end, or the goal, right? I don't love in order to be happy. My goal in loving another person, if it's real love, is just to love. If my goal were to be happy, then it wouldn't be very good love. It would be tainted with self-interest.
But if once you love, and then it's deeply loving, and then you feel it yourself, it will create some happiness on you.
Yeah, happiness would be a result from it, right? But I wonder if that may be an area where Aristotle's, you didn't have a chance to meet Jesus in this life. I don't know. Yes?
I know, Aristotle, he has 4 levels of happiness, and the utmost happiness would be sublime, beatitudo, and that I understood to be a balance between all the other levels. So being content with the physical world, being balanced in your virtue, and also loving other people. So kind of combining different elements. But I don't know.
Yeah, maybe so. Aristotle might say, well, so the goal is to live that happiness then is to be living a life that's filled with love, or that's what that's the highest form of happiness, is to have followed those commandments, to love of God and love of neighbor.
Because I think like the sublime beatitude is supposed to be like heaven on earth. It's supposed to just be like peace, almost like idyllic. And so it's like something to strive for, but it's not necessarily achieved.
Right, everyone would be perfectly virtuous.
What about between conscience and intellect? Very, very important ability of conscience, not always working. Sometimes strong, sometimes weak, and it's very hard to control conscience. It's very hard. I had a problem with intellect and conscience.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where also prayer and God's grace, we have to ask Him for help.
Not everyone can get.
Well, it comes in God's time.
Only chosen people.
It comes in God's time. But I think He wants to give each of us what we need, right? And but it's not always easy, and sometimes we struggle. What did St. Paul said? Why do I do what I don't want to do?
I was very young that time. It was almost 60 years ago. It was martyr, but I was a boy at that time. I was with my girl, but my responsibility was about the girl first, not the guy who was wrestled and was attacked through 4 guys. How I could help him? She was the first on my hand and lifted her hand to help him. No one was around, it was so quiet, even hospital very close. I couldn't do. After 5 years, I got the news that that guy was passed away after he was martyred.
No, these are things that stick with us, right? They're hard.
It was.
It's very hard to try to... I was reading the diary of someone who... He was the engineer on a train in Poland during World War II. And he was the one driving the train back and forth to the death camps. And he said, I just drank a lot. I just drank a lot and tried to not think about what I was doing. But it's interesting, some of the PTSD from war, some of the worst PTSD is not when you experience things happening to other people around you, or even to yourself. Some of the worst PTSD is when you do something wrong. And that can be the most traumatic experience. Soldiers who have committed war atrocities, and they remember very vividly the things that they did wrong and how they can't take it back. And that's, again, as I said, our conscience is meant to protect us. It's meant to protect us so we don't injure our minds and our hearts and end up doing things that traumatize us. because they really do traumatize us. There's such a thing as moral injury. When we do something that's really wrong, it harms us, and it requires a lot of healing for us to get through it.
Yeah, I still feel like yesterday, even almost 60 years ago.
I remember talking to a woman. She had had an abortion when she was 15, pressured by her mother and some other things. I visited her in an assisted living home. She was in her 80s. And she told me, I think about it every morning when I wake up. I wonder about my child. So these things weigh on people. And we shouldn't be naive about that.
How do we listen to the voice of the conscious? Kind of tough, like you.
Well, the Catechism, I think, what it says is we need to create that space in our lives where we can, like Cardinal Sarah had talked about in The Power of Silence. Like you got to have time when you're not running around distracted, where you can actually sit and let God talk to you and let your conscience speak to you. And you can tell that sometimes when people are not happy with their conscience, what do they, like little kids? If little kids are in trouble, what do? They run around like crazy. Because they don't want to, and they don't want to look you in the eye. They want to, da, 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 and you're like, stop it. Like parents will grab them by their shoulders and be like, what's going on? And then, woo! Right? Because you finally get them to stop, and then they got to look at it. And I think that's sometimes we get very frenetic. Look at what the thing now, and this is the big danger with these things, because this provides us with a whole new layer of not having to look here. We just look here instead. And so if I'm starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable about my life and about my choices, I'm like, oh, what's the next thing on Facebook? Right? Because then I don't have to think about this anymore. So we have a lot of ways to escape from the voice of our conscience now. But obviously not, it only ends up harming us in the end, right? You could sit up in the bedroom, turn up the TV, and not pay any attention to the robbers breaking in and taking the things out of your house, but it doesn't, the alarm's going up for a reason,
So what they mean, like people follow your heart, is that they mean like conscious, or they mean?
I mean, to a degree, I think follow your heart, but the problem with follow your heart is that sometimes they can mean, people they will end up not listening to their reason, and they will end up following an emotion that's really not rational. And then that's not, the conscience is not a feeling. When your conscience speaks to you, it speaks to you rationally. So, like this is not right, this is wrong, this is good. But now sometimes your emotions respond to that. So sometimes you only know what's going on in your conscience because of your emotions. So like sometimes you might have a bad feeling, and you're like, why do I have a bad feeling? And then it's like, you have to reason through it and be like, oh, because my conscience is not happy. So that's where emotional states can be helpful, right? Sometimes your emotions can kind of indicate that something's not right. But your conscience is not just an emotional thing. It has to be aligned with reason.
I think you made a good point earlier about God is love, and we love God, we love neighbor. And I think the degree of love that we attain has a reward that God reaps at that particular level. But I don't think we can reach that level or think outside of what real love is. And if we can attain that kind of love, God will meet us there, and we can, if you read the lives of the martyrs, as we're talking about, the martyrs went through that experience. It wasn't a human experience. It wasn't about feelings of love. It was about that real meeting, that level with God, or that love.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fundamentally where Aristotle is. It's not possible for him. He doesn't know about Jesus Christ, so he's not going to have this idea that you could actually have a relationship with God, that you could know God, that you could see God's face, that you could love God and be loved by God in that way. And so I think that's where there's a real there's a real difference on a Christian level that our love or that our happiness cannot be detached, I think, as Christians from an intimacy with God and a love of God that would be really, I mean, that would have to, I think that just is, and fundamentally in eternal life, what makes us happy in eternity with God is that we are immersed in His love, right? I mean, fundamentally, as Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. So there's no, I mean, no matter how virtuous we might become, I mean, fundamentally, for a Christian, it's not about becoming an excellent specimen, right? It's about, and I think that's where grace can make up for so much human weakness, because it's like, well, here I am, my little vicious self, or my little incontinent or continent self, but I'm being carried. But I'm being carried by a God who loves me, and you want to talk about perfect virtue. So He's got me, and He's carrying me through this. Well, I think there's a lot of happiness in that, even in my own weakness and frailty, to know that I'm being lifted up. That doesn't mean that we don't strive, right? I mean, to Lugina's point, we shouldn't be presumptuous. We should still be striving for, and mostly because of the people around us. Why do I strive for virtue? It's not so much for myself, because God is watching over us, but it's the other people around us. It's like, if I love them, well, then I should be trying to be the best person I can for them. Right? And I think that really ends up being the motivator for our work on virtue. It's not so much the love of God, because God loves me no matter what. Right? But if I love my neighbor, I know that being virtuous is going to really be good for my neighbor. Yeah.
Aristotle says that virtue is for the soul.
Yeah. Yeah, well, he talks about it as there are a few different distinctions in virtue, but now the soul being the spiritual dimension of the person. Yep.
And not the Christian definition of the soul. He doesn't have that.
So I think Aristotle would include the intellect in the soul. Right? So it wouldn't be, it's not that the soul, so the virtue, yeah, I mean, it's. Well, he wouldn't necessarily, right, he wouldn't have, Aristotle didn't really have a conception of life after death. I think for him it would be more, if there was any kind of immortality, it would be in the memories of your descendants, things like that. But it wouldn't be, again, it's been a while, but I'm pretty sure Aristotle really didn't have any. Plato had more of a sense of, because of the whole idea of the forms and some of the, but Aristotle was more pretty rooted in just the biological horizontal sense of things. So the soul being more the non-material part of the person.
I just brushed up because I took philosophy last semester, but he did have a concept of an unmoved mover.
Right.
But he didn't understand what we know to be the Judaic God. You know?
Yeah, it's the clockmaker God.
Yeah.
Unmoved mover. It's kind of a remote or distant God, but no sense of incarnation or of any kind of a personal relationship with God, and no sense of an eternal destiny awaiting us either. So what's fascinating to me, though, when you read Aristotle, is that he didn't have any of that, and yet he came to some pretty, when you think about all the different ways you could try and sort out what we should be doing in this life, his is pretty noble, right? He's kind of the classic noble pagan. We probably all know some of them. Somebody who's really you're a good person to be with. You're like a really good person and you're trying to do the right thing. You don't believe anything about God and you're probably really going to struggle in some ways because of it, but you're really nice and you're really good. And there's a lot of moral virtue about you. I've had some very moral, virtuous friends who have been agnostics or atheists. But sometimes the tough thing is this one is actually tough for them sometimes. And they also sometimes really struggle because they're a bit unmoored. They don't have much outside of themselves. So if they hit the rocks or their family, things happen and it's harder. I had a good friend in college. I tell this story. I don't know if I told it here. But he was one of these Aristotelian. He was actually a philosophy major, very moral guy. And then he went to Italy and had a one-night stand with a beautiful Italian woman and decided he didn't really think that was wrong because it was really enjoyable. And I just realized there was nothing to hold him in bounds. If he wanted to decide that was okay, he could. He was the author of his own morality. And so it really, to me, it became very clear that he was kind of unmoored. There was really no rudder there. He was just going to blow with the wind wherever it went. As much as he was trying to be principled. Principle, ultimately, if it's only isolated in one person, I don't think can really function. Because who can say that they're going to hold true to all their principles of their own volition at every moment? So if you don't have something outside of yourself holding you tethered, then I don't know what's, that's where it's a gift, it's our faith is a gift because it doesn't change. Whether I like it or not, it's it's me who has to change, right? It's not like it's the 10 Commandments are the 10 Commandments, and the Catechism is the Catechism. And if my life isn't aligning with that, then it's if one thing's going to change here, it's going to be me, right? And that's the way it is. And I'm more comfortable with that. Because why would I think that the world should change to suit me and my life and my particular circumstances? All of a sudden I'm going to change what I think is right and wrong? That doesn't make sense. So, but it's a gift. Whoa, holy moly. Well, 8:22. Well, what do you say? We can call it a night? Good to see you all. Avery's going to talk to us more about the virtues in detail next week. So that should be fun. It should be good. A little bit less abstract. You can always count on me for abstract.